Thank you, everybody, for joining us. This is the Lincoln Transit Enhancements and Safety Improvements meeting. We should get started at 6 o'clock sharply, so please bear with us in the next few minutes. In the meantime, we're going to play some South African jazz for you. All right. Welcome, everyone, to the Lincoln Transit Enhancements and Safety Improvements virtual meeting. I know that these couple of days have been really tough on our community, and all of your DOTI staff really appreciates you taking the time to be with us today to continue to participate in the public process. We sincerely appreciate it. As you all know, due to the current health crisis, we are trying to figure out ways to still conduct our virtual meetings, our public meetings. This is the third Lincoln Transit meeting, for our project meeting. However, this was the very first one we've held completely online. So please bear with us as we adjust to this new normal. We will try to resolve any technical issues on our side, like sort of on the spot. But before we get started, I really would like to thank Councilman Jolin Clark for helping us spread the word about this meeting through his newsletter and through his social media, and so for supporting this project overall. Next slide, please. We hope this meeting will last about an hour. The presentation from our team will take about 35 minutes or so, going over the existing conditions, the survey results, and then the project design. The team will be answering questions at 2 different times throughout the presentation. So I'll be giving instructions about the Q&A in a couple of minutes. Next, please. Our team is going to go over through a lot of information. Some of it may be technical, so we recommend turning on your closed captioning so that it's a little bit easier to follow. To turn them on, just click on the double CC icon on your video controls. The system automatically picks English. Para nuestros amigos y residentes que prefieren escuchar la información en español, el sistema de Microsoft Teams nos deja ver toda esta información con subtítulos. Para activar los subtítulos, por favor, haga clic en el icono con las 2 rueditas y seleccione español. The information for our Vietnamese friends that are watching is on the screen. Please turn on the closed captioning so it's easier for you to follow. Next slide. Since this is a virtual meeting, please forgive any crazy noises that you may hear in the back or random visitors as our pets. Coco, my dog, may be coming just randomly onto the screen or begging for food, so I apologize for that. If you yourself are experiencing technical difficulties, please exit and re-enter the meeting. Usually that solves the majority of the Microsoft Teams general issues when it's from the participant side of things. This meeting is also being recorded, so if you know anybody who couldn't make it, please let them know that there will be a recording of this meeting in about 10 business days in Dottie's YouTube channel. We have created a short bit.ly for it, is bit.ly/Dottie YouTube. The Dottie and the Y and the T out of YouTube is capitalized. Please remember that. As always, please be courteous and respectful of your Dottie team and of each other. We will not be acknowledging any rude, derogatory, or disrespectful comments or questions in the Q&A box. Next. So, next slide, please. Oh, there we go. Okay. So for this meeting, we are expecting a lot of questions from you. So we're trying something a little bit different this time around. Just like previous virtual meetings, you can ask your questions by clicking on the little Q&A icon on the top right portion of your page. You obviously just type the questions, and as always, you can submit your comments or questions anonymously if you want. This time, though, we are going to prioritize the questions and comments with the most likes. So just like Facebook, Instagram, if you like a particular person's question or comment, on the top right portion, there's the 3 little bubbles, the 3 little dots on that person's comment that you can click. It opens up sort of the emojis, and just give it a thumbs up, a heart, whatever one of those that you prefer. That way our team knows that that is a topic that we certainly need to address and moves it sort of up to the top. So you yourselves will know, obviously, which ones go up to the top, which are the hot topics and which ones are not. It's a little bit easier to follow sort of for the Q&A box, segment, what is going to be easier. In addition to that, staff will try to answer sort of the smaller basic questions directly on the chat box. So most of your comments and questions will be automatically published for everybody to see. Please, if you like a particular person's comment or question, click the thumbs up button. And that, we know that that's a hot topic. And then also our staff will try to answer sort of any questions that are sort of falling behind or that are relatively easy to answer. We will post, as always, we will post a FAQ to our page itself, or sort of like a little transcript of the frequently asked questions for everybody to see after the meeting. Next slide. Next slide. Thank you. And with that, let me present to you your Lincoln Transit team. My name is Gaby Cerrado. I am the Council Community Designer for Council District 7. I work closely with the Baker, West Wash, Platt Park residents that are here tonight, and I'll be your moderator for the evening. Zach Wallace, as a lot of you know, he's one of our Dottie's best transit planners, and he is the project manager for this project, the Lincoln Transit Project. Some of you may know Brett Boncory. He used to be our area engineer, but he's no longer there, tears. But he's actually also leading the Alameda after study and the Downing speed and access study for West Wash Park friends that are present. He will be talking to you about the Vision Zero improvements that we will be doing with this project. Ryan Billings, he's our transit team manager, and he's making sure that this project, as well as sort of the bigger bubble of things, this project meets the vision and intent for the overall city goals. Dan Merritt, he is our RTD project manager. He's helping Zach and Brett address the transit service needs of the corridor. In addition to that, we also have Ellen Forhofer and Stephen Rijo on standby, who will be answering those questions on the Q&A directly, in the Q&A box directly. And with that, I will pass it over to Zach, who will be providing us a recap of the transit improvements that we're trying to do. Zach?
Great, thanks, Gabby. I'll start here just to reorient everyone with the corridor that we're talking about today, since it's been a little while since we've seen you all. North is to the right of your screen, and you can see the arrow there indicating that downtown is just off the screen to the north or to the right. To the south, we have the Broadway Light Rail Station, and then what we're looking at here is outlined in kind of the dashed red line. We are looking at Lincoln Street between Ohio and approximately 7th Avenue, so just north of Spear. Sorry, my screens are a little messed up. So next we will talk just about the background of this project, and we'll cover some high-level background first, just to kind of set the stage for where this project came from. So back in 2016, the city completed the Denver Moves Broadway Lincoln study, which created a multimodal vision for both the Broadway and Lincoln corridors, since they act as one in this area. In 2017, a project was completed that we call Phase 1. These were near-term, quick-build improvements to improve the speed and reliability of transit along the Broadway-Lincoln corridor. Phase 1 included expanding the bus-only lanes to 24 hours on Broadway between downtown and the I-25 and Broadway light rail station, and on Lincoln as well, north of 7th Avenue. In 2017, the city released its Vision Zero action plan. Just for those who don't know what Vision Zero is quickly, the Vision Zero program seeks to eliminate traffic deaths and serious injuries that occur within our transportation system. So the data that we used to create this plan, or that was used to create this action plan, showed that only 5% of streets within Denver accounted for 50% of traffic deaths. So these 5% of streets became what is called the high injury network and are a focus point of our Vision Zero program. I know the image is hard to see on the screen here, but we can definitely link to all the action plans and our FAQs that Gabby was talking about. But Lincoln Street is denoted as part of the high injury network north of Alameda and all the way up to 20th Avenue. And so it's therefore a focus corridor for safety improvements. Next, in January 2019, after public engagement and outreach, the city released its Denver Moves Transit Plan, which serves as guiding framework for improving the quality of transit in Denver. The plan identifies Broadway Lincoln as a high capacity transit corridor, which means it has high level of passenger capacity, frequent service, and serves as a connection between the regional rail network and the local bus network. The plan envisions these corridors to have dedicated bus lanes, enhanced stops, improved service, among other things. Later in 2019, City Council adopted the Blueprint Denver Plan, which serves as a guide for where and how the city wants to grow. That plan identified specific street priorities for many of the streets across the city, and for Lincoln, it was worth noting that in this area, it did denote Lincoln as a transit priority street, and then around certain intersections along the corridor, it denoted them as transit and pedestrian priority street, so giving a nod to kind of the little pockets of activity that you see on Lincoln, like closer to like 5th Avenue and things like that. And then finally, in December 2019, RTD wrapped up its regional BRT network feasibility study. So again, quickly for folks who don't know, BRT is Bus Rapid Transit, which is essentially a high quality bus-based transit system that delivers fast, comfortable, and cost-effective services at almost like metro level capacities, right? Like metro subway system. It has elements of light rail or a metro system, but utilizes buses instead. These systems have been pretty popular in places like Latin America. So if you've ever been to like Bogota or Mexico City, you're likely familiar with what that looks like. But they're also becoming popular here. So LA has their Orange Line, that's a good example. There's also examples in Cleveland, Eugene, Oregon, Pittsburgh, among others. So with that background, RTD began their BRT study with 23 candidate corridors and narrowed them down with each tier of analysis. The Broadway-Lincoln corridor made it to tier 4, which is kind of the final tier of analysis, along with 8 other corridors that were the most promising corridors for BRT implementation. So with that, we'll move. With that, it's just showcasing that there's quite a few studies and plans that focus in on Broadway and Lincoln, serving as an important transit corridor for the city, making some vital connections as kind of the spine of the city. Next, we'll move into the timeline for the specific planning process, what we're calling phase 2. Again, I'm showing phase 1 here in orange, the improvements that occurred on Broadway in the northern section of Lincoln. During those phase 1 improvements, it was always envisioned that this section of Lincoln between I-25 and 7th Avenue would be a phase 2. So about a year ago in June 2019, we kicked off a high-level visioning survey. That was followed by a public meeting and an open house in October. And also another survey, a little more detailed survey. That survey provided us with a lot of great feedback and has really helped shape the proposal. So thank you all for putting your kind of time and effort into those comment boxes and those rankings. They really helped us kind of shape this moving forward. It quickly became clear from both our October meetings and the survey results that it was really time to engage our Vision Zero team last fall. To help us address more thoroughly the safety concerns that were being raised by you all in those comments and in the meetings. So in January, we pulled in our Vision Zero team. We conducted a walk audit of the corridor. We did an in-depth analysis with the Vision Zero team of the corridor using the data and what we saw while we were out on the corridor, your all's comments, and we really worked with them to start incorporating Vision Zero and safety elements. We did pause the transit piece of this project, which is why it's taking us so long to kind of come back. We put the transit piece on hold to allow that safety Vision Zero piece to kind of catch up and be kind of an integral part of this project. Let's see. So in May, once we had those elements in place, we met with a focus group comprised of some of your neighbors back in May, or I guess last month, not back in, but just a month ago. And they provided some additional feedback that has further helped kind of refine the design for what we will be presenting to you today in just a little bit. Obviously, we're here in June at the public meeting, and then from here, we'll incorporate any final comments and tweaks as needed and get things ready for our design and operations folks to implement. As a reminder, I also have this yellow box on here. We went through all the city's documents that showed Lincoln being a pretty important street for the transit system, or the transit network, I should say, for the city. And so in the last box, you'll just see a reminder that this project isn't it for Lincoln. We're not closing the book on it. Obviously, there's a lot more plans that kind of dictate, or not dictate, but help guide where Lincoln should be in the future. So this is just a step 1 with the funding that we have available to get some near-term safety and transit improvements installed along the corridor. Next, I'll walk through the existing conditions. I'll move through these pretty quickly because I know you all want to get to the updated proposal, and also because you all live on the corridor, so you know these existing conditions, but they will come into play kind of later on in the proposal, so it's worth kind of going over them for just a couple minutes and becoming familiar with them. So let me advance forward. So first we'll talk about safety. This image shows the number of crashes over the last 5 years. Again, oriented with north to the right of your screen, so downtown is off the screen, kind of to the right. The larger the dot, the higher number of crashes. So we're seeing kind of like the 6th and Spear intersection popping, Alameda, Ohio. But there's also still a significant number of crashes on the local streets kind of in between those larger streets, which is worth noting and worth our kind of attention. It is also worth noting this is only one data point that's just serving as a visual for this presentation. There's obviously a lot more that factors into safety concerns that we took into account. That you gave us all on the feedback that we heard from the survey, from the meetings. Also, what we all experienced when we were out walking the corridor, which includes, unsafe pedestrian conditions, both walking along and crossing Lincoln. Also the vehicle speeds, which at certain points of the day are quite alarming, actually. And I think you all are aware of that, and you told us that pretty clearly. But just noting that what you see here is not the only point of analysis, it's just a kind of a visual representation. Next, we'll talk through a reminder of some of the 2019 baseline RTD data. A reminder that the Zero, which serves Broadway Lincoln, is RTD's third busiest route, and it serves about 10,000 riders a day. The Zero, along with other morning rush hour buses that utilize the corridor, mean that there's about 3 to 4 buses coming every minute, or a bus coming every 3 to 4 minutes, excuse me. And then in the evening periods, there's a bus coming about every 6 minutes. So pretty busy corridor for transit for Denver standards. Also a reminder that RTD is seeing delays along this corridor, especially in that afternoon rush hour when there's not that dedicated lane there, which is impacting riders' ability to make transfers, further delaying their overall journeys. It also impacts RTD's ability to efficiently serve the Broadway Lincoln corridor during those peak times. So, you know, maybe not a lot of people are moving north on Lincoln at that time, but there's a lot of people moving south, and those buses really need to circulate and get people moving. Next, we'll talk about vehicular traffic. I just added some visuals, so hopefully this helps with this slide. But it's kind of a busy slide, but essentially it's just showing the traffic volume on Lincoln throughout the week, day by day. And essentially the highlight here is that we see kind of that morning peak, you know, starting a little after 6 a.m.-ish every weekday. Then, you know, around 9 a.m. things kind of mellow out and the volumes go back down. And then starting about 3 p.m. on those weekdays, we start seeing that afternoon peak for that evening rush hour again. And that's pretty consistent throughout the week. You can see some differentiation there between the days, but it's pretty consistent overall. And then when we look at Saturday, we see kind of not necessarily a peak, but just kind of a steady traffic flow throughout that afternoon period. And then on Sunday, there's, you know, it just relatively lower traffic volumes. Now we'll talk about parking. I'll be brief here. I think you all know what's going on the corridor, but just to reiterate, because this will come back later, there's existing about 247 parking spaces along Lincoln on the east side of the street between Ohio and 6th Avenue. And of course, that parking is available 22 hours a day during the weekdays and 24 hours a day on the weekends. So with that, I think there's probably a lot of questions coming in. Yes, we'll kind of pause and turn it back to Gabby for some questions before we move into what we heard in the October surveys and then how we're kind of moving forward with this project.
Nice. Thank you, Zach. Yes, definitely a lot of good questions coming in. Please continue to submit your comments, questions, and continue liking other people's questions and comments. It looks like it's working pretty great. Again, if you have a question, there's a Q&A icon on the top right. Just go ahead and type your question away. You can click on anonymous if you want to submit it so that nobody knows that it was you submitting it. So we have the first question. Actually, I can answer it. Sorry, I just lost it. Where did it go? Oh, there we go. From Mac. When will we see better pedestrian access from the east side of Lincoln to either Alameda and I-25 light rail stations? So we are working, there's several projects that are happening underway between Baker and the West Wash and Platt Park neighborhoods. The biggest one for I-25 and Broadway station in particular is the reconstruction of the I-25 and Broadway interchange. That project, the first phase, actually should get started on construction a little bit, which is the widening of Exposition in order to allow that north access to the station. Should get started. The construction of that should get started here shortly. And then phase 2, which is mainly the biggest chunk, is that realignment of that southbound on-ramp from Broadway itself. Now, while reconstructing that ramp is obviously a highway project, what goes along with it is that better connections and more sidewalk amenities and trail amenities to provide much better sidewalk and bicycle access to the station itself. During the Q&A transcript, we will be posting, or I will be posting on the chat room itself, the link to that project page so you can find more information and maps. On the center side, so that's for the south side. For Alameda Station itself, we have a couple of projects, Alameda Vision Study that we just wrapped up a few months ago, basically providing better amenities for that east-west connection on Alameda itself, and then through the community transportation networks, South Central. That is one of the elements that we need to hear from you all about. Where are sort of those pinch points that makes you feel unsafe, so that we can allocate proper funding for that. Actually, we're having a meeting on that, another virtual meeting, I believe on the, not tomorrow's the other one, sorry, on the 27th, I believe. I don't know, Brett, if you know off the top of your head when that next meeting is at. But I'll be posting this information on the chat room right now. The second question for Zach or for Brett, how is the proposal aligned with Vision Zero? And I know that you're still sort of about to jump on that, but can you give us a little bit of a sneak preview, Zach or Brett?
Yeah, sure. I can jump in there, Gabby. Thanks. Great question. Like Zach mentioned, as part of this kind of signing and striping transit project that we're doing, we heard from you all loud and clear from the last public meeting that safety was a huge concern, right? And so this allowed us some time to get back to the drawing board to look at some quick build type Vision Zero improvements, kind of at the same level that the transit project is, with that kind of just signing and striping to look at. And then, as you'll see, identify some future projects. And so, like Gabby mentioned, I'll be talking about that in depth in a couple minutes here, but great question.
Thanks. All right, question 3 for Ryan. This is coming from Mike. I am new to the area, so unfamiliar with the history of Lincoln, but what is the thinking behind Lincoln being a one-way 4-lane highway rather than a normal 2-way street, similar to Logan? Is changing this design part of any of these discussions, or are just not under consideration?
Yeah, great question. And welcome to Denver. So I think, as Zach pointed out in kind of the beginning section, there's been a lot of planning work done on the corridor over the last several years. And a few years ago, this really kind of all started with Denver Moves Broadway Lincoln, and that study, as I mentioned in the chat, that study identified both Broadway and Lincoln remaining a one-way couplet, so one way northbound for Lincoln and one way southbound for Broadway for the future. So no current plans to make either of those facilities two-way.
Thank you. Zach, this one is from Rob. Why does the plan stop at 7th Avenue? Just 9 more blocks to connect to the mall shuttle and other buses.
Yeah, sorry, I had to find my unmute button there. So north of 7th Avenue, there's an existing 24-hour transit lane on Lincoln that gets the buses up to 14th Avenue. And then there's a signal, it's called a queue jump there. So essentially the buses waiting at 14th Avenue after they board or let folks off are then given a priority signal where they can cut across and then make the turn, that left-hand turn onto Colfax, and then connect up into or provide connections to that mall route or all the other kind of downtown routes, the light rail as well and all that.
So I'm not seeing a lot of questions about existing conditions. A lot of them are referring sort of, they want to know obviously about the bigger design, and probably some of the, as we get through this, probably some of those questions get answered. Let me just double check one moment. So we have a question, Zach, from Brittany. How do you plan to make bus stops more desirable and safety, and to encourage folks to use the buses?
Sure, and there's nothing specific to this project, but I might actually call in Ellen if that's okay. I know she's working on some bus stop projects, and I'm not sure, or maybe Ryan. Ryan, you can answer as well. Nothing specific as part of this project, but there is some other things that the city is working on. So I'll turn that over to either Ryan or Ellen.
Yeah, I can answer that. So great question. Obviously, when we think about these corridors, we would think about the end state and improving all aspects from a transit standpoint, including the bus stops. One of the things that we're doing as a city that's very new is standing up a passenger amenity program, so a bus stop program. There's about 3,000 bus stops in the city and county of Denver right now, and those are all constructed and maintained and by various entities, including the city, RTD, bids, and property owners. So one of the things that we're looking forward to is developing that program and starting to implement and improve bus stops at a citywide level. We're doing that. We're starting to do that work in far northeast Denver right now. As part of Broadway Lincoln specifically, there's obviously some work happening and some design work happening on South Broadway section. There's the work happening on Lincoln through this project and other efforts around the area. One of the things that we're thinking about as I guess a phase 3, if you will, is starting to get some of the bus stop amenities in place as part of an overall project. So what you'll see a lot of times at the city level is that we don't always have money to go out and build to that preferred aspirational vision that we have for a corridor. Sometimes we have to tackle this in phases or in steps. This is a good example of that one of the next steps that we want to take is to improve the bus stops throughout the corridor.
Thank you. I think we have a lot of questions about design. And so I think it may be probably better. Let's jump onto, Zach, if you don't mind, what we heard about from the surveys, and then jumping over to the site and see what questions we have answered just through the presentation.
Yep, sounds good. All right, there we go. All right, thanks, Gabby. So now we'll cover what we heard from that October survey. Again, I'm not sure if I mentioned before, but we received over 500 responses to that survey, so we had quite a bit of data to work with. Thank you all again for taking the time to fill that out. As many folks may remember, there were 4 options that we kind of put out to the community to react to and rank and comment on. So you'll see those images on your screen now with how they stacked up with the community ranking. So you'll see the most favored in terms of just that ranking, that just 1 through 4 options was option C, which had that 24-hour transit lane in the east lane and then a shared lane on the west lane that provided some overnight parking. The least favorite option by the community was option A, which expanded expanded the existing bus lane to 24 hours and made no other changes to the corridor. But if folks remember, the survey also allowed you to put comments under each of the options. And so folks really utilized those comment boxes, and we were able to get kind of a lot of detail about what folks were liking, what they were hating, what they were concerned with. And that kind of shakes out into this graph here, which is essentially just kind of, we put all of the comments into buckets and just kind of tallied them up. So you can see here a large amount of folks are concerned about parking. This was in regards to the potential loss of parking on Long Lincoln or more limited parking along Lincoln. There were also folks concerned about overflow parking from Broadway, as well as folks who were concerned about overflow parking from Lincoln onto Sherman and Grant, as well as concern about where there would be parking for kind of those midday delivery trucks and service vehicles that are pretty prevalent throughout that midday period. The next top comments you'll see here are it's kind of a juxtaposition, right? We have folks saying there's no need for a 24-hour bus lane, just make it peak hours only, make it 12 hours, make it not 24 hours. 24 hours is too much, not warranted. But then conversely, we had almost just as many folks saying, absolutely, we need a 24-hour transit lane on Lincoln. So again, quite an interesting kind of juxtaposition there. It really shows kind of the opposing interests, if you will, at play, depending on where folks live or how they commute or, just their familiarity with this corridor. So just kind of just wanting to highlight that since they came up next to each other and just noting that the city is kind of balancing these viewpoints and trying to understand the trade-offs of each. Next, I'm sure is unsurprising to folks, and we've already talked about it a bit, but there was a large concern about safety that came up. I'm sure kind of if you tallied up some of the other comments here, there would be kind of more in safety just because, some folks wanting to reduce the number of lanes, for example, might have been indicating safety concerns. Again, there were tons of comments, so it was hard to kind of say, oh yeah, this one was about this too. But these are how the bucket shook out. Again, safety, a big concern. The comments that you see on your screen here really help push us forward into how we are moving forward. And since safety was such a large concern that we heard very loud and clear from all of our conversations, from all the emails, from our public meetings, from the survey results, And because safety improvements are largely agnostic to the ultimate layout of the bus and parking lanes, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn things over to my colleague Brett, who will discuss in detail the safety improvements that are coming to the corridor, the Vision Zero improvements, and then I'll jump back in after Brett and discuss to you the changes in the street operations, so the transit-only lane, the vehicular travel lanes, and the parking. So with that, I'll turn it over to Brett, and then I'll be back in just a few minutes.
Great, thanks, Zach. So as Zach mentioned, while we're doing this signing and striping transit project, and as we previously mentioned in the question answer, we want to take a look at quick build and future Vision Zero improvements that we can install along with it. So these improvements were determined as a result of some crash analysis that we did, a Vision Zero walk audit that the team conducted, and the community feedback that we heard from you all. It's displayed here on the left, the themes that we heard. And I will say as a note, we wanted to dive in and use the whole quick build safety toolbox that we have to address these comments. And so that's kind of the universe of improvements that we could pull from. So as I mentioned, on the left side of this slide, we show kind of high-level themes from the community feedback that we heard from you all. This feedback really highlighted, the speeding vehicles that we're seeing along Lincoln that leads to that highway feel throughout the neighborhood that's already been mentioned tonight. In addition, we heard that it also, because of this, feels dangerous to walk along and across Lincoln due to these high speeds, and because the sidewalk's proximity to speeding vehicles. So just a note, we're going to kind of get into the nitty-gritty on these improvements as I walk through these, but we really wanted to give you a good idea of how we're using this effort as a quick build opportunity to improve safety along this corridor. And you'll see this basically through 9 general categories of improvements that we'll walk through right now. So here we go. Firstly, we wanted to mention that some existing projects that are already moving forward are 2 traffic signals that are being installed in this corridor beginning later this year. And this is at Exposition and the 5th Avenue intersections. Of course, this will include updated signal infrastructure, safe pedestrian crossings to go with it, and obviously better visibility for turning movements and such. So that's a huge infrastructure that's already being installed later this year. Next, as part of a need for more pedestrian crossings, which we kind of heard loud and clear, is we'll be evaluating additional signals with controlled pedestrian crossings that at Dakota and the 4th Avenue intersections. Now, due to COVID-19 conditions, it looks like we'll only be able to conduct this study starting in the next couple months because of traffic volumes wanting to wait till they're at least somewhat normal. But while other improvements we're talking about are short-term, this one category of improvements is more long-term in nature due to those longer lead times that it would take to install a signal. So because of that, we have some other improvements, which we'll mention here, that we plan to install in the near term to mitigate some of the safety issues that we're seeing. And then one of the most effective strategies for slowing speeds on these like big multi-lane one-way arterials like Lincoln is what we call speed management through signal timing. We're timing the signal progression to a slower speed. So as you go through the signals, that those signals are set to a certain speed. So we're retiming those to a slower speed, particularly in the off-peak hours, because this is when the road is open, and this is when we see a lot of those higher speeds. So that's happening in kind of a quicker implementation that we can do. And then as we walk the corridor, we notice that there is some low-hanging fruit improvements in marking stop bars, north-south crosswalks at the side streets at about 5 locations along the corridor. And what this does, of course, is provide better clarity for pedestrians crossing north and south along the corridor and shows where that pedestrian space is designated. And then last on this slide is at the Lincoln and Alameda intersection. We had the opportunity to install what we call a paint and post pedestrian refuge at the crosswalk on the east side of the intersection to help decrease what we call pedestrian exposure to those wide travel lanes when crossing Alameda. This means that you kind of have a little bit more of a refuge as you're kind of crossing there, so it's not fully exposed to all that pavement, all those travel lanes. If you've been in the Colfax area recently, it's similar to some of the Vision Zero improvements we recently installed there. We actually have a photo in the top right of this slide that shows our installation from that recent project. And then on the bottom right of this slide kind of shows a graphical depiction of what those medians might look like. Next slide. So moving on, at 3 locations on the corridor, we saw that there's a need for daylighting. What this means is that we will be removing some parking spots right around the corners of the intersections to establish safer conditions, so better visibility for turning and crossing motorists, people walking, biking, and rolling. And then in some cases, we have had to do this daylighting to allow more space for motorist turning movements and bus turning movements when we have buses trying to access the side streets. In addition, we saw that there's actually 5 locations where we saw current or developing bike and pedestrian safety issues in our crash data. At 3 of these locations, those locations are Dakota and 4th Avenue and Maple. Dakota and 4th Avenue being where, like I mentioned, we're evaluating traffic signal installations for the long term. But in the interim, we'll be installing painted bulb outs to encourage slower motorist turning speeds and improve safety really for all users. When we slow those motorists down when they make their turns, this obviously improves safety for pedestrians that are crossing, bikes that are crossing, and everyone in between. An example of these bulb outs is a photo that's in the top right of this screen, also installed along the Colfax corridor. And then at 2 of these locations, at Virginia and Ellsworth Avenues, we'll be installing these painted bulb outs, but then also along with some hardened center lines is what we're calling them. This is kind of a little bit of a technical term, but these hardened center lines, we showed them in the bottom right. This is like an example from New York City. They further encourage slower turning speeds, particularly for left turns, as you can see in that photo, and help mitigate against some of those bike pedestrian versus left turn motorist crashes that we're seeing. And then lastly, and I'm kind of stealing Zach's thunder on this one, sorry, Zach, but as part of the street operations modifications to this project that we're about to talk to you about, we'll actually have 2 motorist travel lanes and parking on both sides during the nights and weekends. This obviously leads kind of to what we call visual narrowing of the street, adding some of that friction, decreasing that highway feel, and it decreases pedestrian exposure when they're crossing Lincoln. They don't have to cross so many active travel lanes. And it adds obviously a vertical and horizontal separation between vehicle and pedestrian space during the times of the week that we have the highest pedestrian activity, which are those nights and weekends when people are either home along Lincoln or walking to and from the amazing destinations that we have on Broadway Lincoln corridor. So that kind of wraps it up. And I do just want to mention that we're happy to say that the project team has secured some Vision Zero funding for implementation of these improvements, which is great news, meaning we have the funding to be able to advance these improvements in addition to the transit improvements that you're about to see Zach go over. So I'll hand it back over to Zach to talk about the street operations portion.
Great, thanks, Brett. And I'll just kind of take Brett's momentum there and really kind of emphasize or express my gratitude to the community for kind of voicing your or just using your voice in those surveys, excuse me. We were really able to use that those added pieces of information that you provided us about safety concerns, just as added justification for prioritizing these safety improvements. So, obviously Lincoln is on the high injury network, but there's also several other corridors on the high injury network. And so kind of with your input, we were able to show, why these safety improvements should be prioritized here. And, as Brett mentioned, secured additional funding for us to be able to implement those safety elements. So now I'll kind of go through very high level some of the concerns and solutions for what we're calling our street operations, so transit, vehicle traffic, and parking. And then after that, I'll kind of walk through what a typical day will look like along Lincoln, and then we'll have some more questions. So in terms of transit, again, what we were hearing from folks is that they didn't think a 24-hour lane was necessary for the corridor. They thought it was a bit much. Conversely, we heard folks saying that they wanted a 24-hour lane. And then additionally, if you remember, we kind of presented the 4 options just kind of as they were, 24/7. Here's what's on the table. So we had folks saying, the 7-day condition is not warranted. Please, the weekends need to be treated differently. So we definitely heard you loud and clear. What we're moving forward with in this section of Lincoln will be a peak only hour bus lane for this stretch of Lincoln. Sorry, I'm being redundant here. We acknowledge that the context of this corridor is pretty unique compared to the more northern section of Lincoln, compared to Broadway in this area. And therefore it merits a different approach. So the bus lanes will operate on Lincoln in this area from 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. and then again from 3 p.m. to 7 p.m. And again, we agree with what the community was saying about the 7-day condition. The weekend bus frequencies just don't warrant needing their own lane, nor do the traffic conditions. And so that will the peak hour bus lanes will be weekdays only. Now we'll move to traffic. So again, I think a lot of our traffic comments were related to safety, like asking us to reduce a lane, although sometimes it wasn't that explicit. But there were also calls for folks saying that we absolutely need to reduce the speed of vehicles on this corridor, especially kind of in those evenings and weekends. And then, just pointing out here that there were several folks who did comment again about kind of please don't reduce any travel lanes on Lincoln. They're concerned about overflow traffic. They're concerned about adding to congestion that's already prevalent on Lincoln in this area. So what we're able to do is we are able to reduce the number of travel lanes during the night and weekend. So this is what Brett was just alluding to. We'll essentially have 2 through travel lanes during those night and weekend times. Our traffic volumes show that Lincoln can function with only those 2 lanes during those overnight and weekend time periods. And last but certainly not least, as we mentioned earlier, parking. We heard a lot about parking. Again, folks concerned about losing their parking along Lincoln or having it kind of limited. Concern over where midday deliveries or service vehicles, contractors, visitors would be able to park during that midday period. But also folks concerned about overflow from Broadway and overflow onto Sherman and Grant as 2 examples of side streets that folks are concerned about. So as Brett alluded to again, the parking will be maintained on the east side of Lincoln overnight. Additionally, parking will remain between those bus only lane hours to accommodate those delivery vehicles, those service vehicles, other visitors or needs that need that space during the middle of the day. Additionally, we'll be adding parking to the west side of the street overnight. And so I just want to point out here, I know we had a subset of survey participants who were concerned that there was going to be too much parking on Lincoln if we added kind of both sides. And while this solution, adding parking to both sides, does end up helping to address the parking concerns kind of on the other side of the coin, the addition of parking on this west side is really about safety, as Brett was alluding to. Having kind of parked cars on both sides at this point in time is able to help visually narrow that roadway, slow down those vehicles, but also provide a buffer between the roadway and the sidewalk for folks walking along Lincoln. But it also creates more of a buffer for folks crossing Lincoln. Right now, they only have 2 active travel lanes to cross rather than 4. So it was really more of a safety concern, but on the flip side does help address some of those overflow parking concerns that folks had. So now on the next few slides, we'll walk through what a typical day will look like for Lincoln in cross-section view. So what cross-section view is essentially it's like we're standing in the middle of the roadway, looking north at the lanes and each of their designated purposes. So we'll start on the weekday during that morning rush hour, so 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. There will be 3 drive lanes and a bus only lane. This is the exact same situation that there is now in that morning rush hour period, but the bus only lane will be just 1 hour longer. RTD needs that lane cleared a little bit sooner. Currently, I think they're saying that the lane, currently the lane is 7 to 9, and they're saying that lane isn't cleared until, sometimes 7:30, 7:45, which is, halfway through that peak period. So we are expanding that AM peak period by an hour to 6 a.m. So again, 6 a.m. to 9 a.m., 3 drive lanes and a bus only lane. After 9 a.m., that bus only lane switches to parking. So there's that parking for those delivery vehicles, for those service vehicles, for any of those visitors. and that remains in place until 3 p.m. So it allows all those deliveries to happen, all those services to happen, kind of in that late morning to early afternoon period. At 3 p.m., excuse me, essentially we revert back to that peak condition where there's 3 drive lanes and a bus only lane. So again, that same condition that's there today in that morning period, but now it will be from 3 to 7. And then after 7 p.m., what you want to watch is the westernmost lane and the easternmost lane. So they change from drive and bus only to parking on both sides. So this is where we have that narrowing of the roadway, or using parked cars essentially as a buffer for folks walking, for folks crossing that street, and to help slow down those cars a bit, because that the overnight condition is when we're seeing those speeds creep up into some very concerning levels. The weekend condition is the same as the overnight condition, but we just want to kind of spell it out for folks. Again, with those 2 parking lanes on either side and the 2 drive lanes in the middle. And this weekend condition essentially begins at 7 p.m. Friday night. So as soon as that bus only lane ends at 7 p.m., this kicks in and you have parking until 6 a.m. Monday morning, when then it reverts back to the 3 drive lanes and the bus only lane. So while we feel this solution addresses many of the community's concerns, while also providing the city and the buses with speed and reliability improvements, we do also recognize that this is a little bit complicated. This is a solution that is new for the city, something that we haven't done before, but something that we thought merited consideration given the community's concerns and the unique nature of this corridor. That being said, we'll definitely monitor this condition over time and make sure that it's working and functioning. And if we need to make tweaks and adjustments, we can definitely look into that. But we felt that a lot of folks were saying we need the peak only bus lanes. We really want that midday parking, not only for those deliveries, but just so there isn't 4 open lanes of roadway in the middle of the day. When the buses aren't coming as frequently, and you essentially have that lower volume in the middle of the day, as we talked about earlier. So again, just recognizing that this is kind of a new condition for the city, and we'll definitely kind of watch it and monitor it over time. And with that, I think.
Well.
Oh, sorry. Nope. One more. Sorry, Gabby. Just bringing it back a high level really quick. Just showing you kind of, again, these are almost the same as the existing conditions. Some of them match the graphics that we saw earlier. But just letting folks know that, currently we have 10 hours of transit only lanes on Lincoln. We'll now have 35 hours in this stretch per week. And so that's a 250% increase in transit only lane hours. So that's a huge increase and helps get those buses through in the times when they're really stuck. Well, also vehicular lane hours will be reduced by 20%. But again, this is during those night and weekend conditions when the traffic volume shows, or the volume data shows that Lincoln can function with just those 2 lanes. It's almost a right sizing, we'll call it, of those vehicle lanes. That overnight and weekend parking, again, you still have those 247 spaces on the east side of the street available to you overnight. But then, and on the weekends, but then there will also be an approximately 226 spaces added to that west side in those overnight and weekend parking conditions. So that's about a 92% increase, 92% increase in that parking capacity. And then, as Brett mentioned, there are several Vision Zero improvements happening along the corridor, and with that additional funding that we have secured, we're able to improve 11 intersections along the stretch of Lincoln. So now with that, I'll turn it back to you, Gabby.
All right. The team is ready because we definitely have a lot of questions. And the presentation ended. I'm not sure why. So let's jump in for a question from Martin to Ryan. Will you be opening a fund to support repairs to the foundations of adjacent homes due to the additional vibration from passing buses?
Yeah, so there's no funding available for kind of mitigations related to buses and the vibrations associated with those at this time. It's obviously something that we want to continue to monitor, but we don't have specific funding in place for how buses affect houses as that lane is currently being used by buses.
All right. Question number 2 from, I would probably say Zach or Scott may be able to answer this one. This one is somebody that wanted to stay anonymous. I live on the west side, commercial and residential of Lincoln, within the 400 block. And the only parking that we have is limited. So we all, for the most part, have to park, receive guests, get deliveries, and have workers to get done on our homes via the parking lane. How do you expect us to function without parking? And I guess sort of the proposed design would actually add parking. So Zach, would you mind going over a little bit again, specifically for that southern segment? What are we looking at for parking?
Parking on the west side?
On the west side and just our southern side in general.
Okay, sure. So yeah, parking on the west side will be added. So currently there's no parking on that west side of Lincoln. There will be parking added on that west side overnight, so from 7 p.m. to 6 a.m. And then on the east side of the street where there's currently parking 22 hours a day, you will still have parking overnight, and then in the midday period from 9 a.m. until 3 p.m. And then, you know, the side streets still retain their parking except in instances where it's near the corner, as Brett mentioned, where we're going to be daylighting. So kind of pulling back the parking spaces a bit so there's more room for folks to visually see pedestrians or bicyclists along the corridor. So hopefully that helped answer the question, Gabby.
Yeah, I think so. Thank you. For Brett, how is safety? Can you go over again how safety is being addressed on the 500, 600, and 700 blocks? Again, this is on that south side, south of Virginia, in the corridor.
Yeah, good question. So I tried to look because I don't go by addresses. As a transportation engineer, I go by streets. So I tried to look, and I think I got a good list here. It's a good question. Like I mentioned, there will be a traffic signal installed at Exposition that will come with pedestrian crossings, obviously an additional stop when it's red. There, it gives us a better opportunity to manage speeds. The more signals that we have, the better opportunity is to manage speeds through that signal timing, like I mentioned, which will also be happening. And we'll be retiming those signals for lower speeds in the off-peak in particular. And then at Virginia, we're actually kind of throwing our whole suite of paint and post Vision Zero elements at Virginia. So Virginia is going to get stop bars, crosswalks, bulb outs, and that centerline hardening that we were talking about at Virginia. And then, of course, in addition, all of the all of the benefits that we get from going down to 2 lanes in the off-peak is, again, when we see a lot of that speeding, and allowing some more of that horizontal and vertical separation between motorists and pedestrians that will happen when we have parked cars there. So, good question.
Okay. For Mr. Ryan, why is a permanent removal of a travel lane on Lincoln not being considered?
Yeah, great question. So this is kind of a multi-part answer. It's obviously, per usual, not easy to say one specific thing about it. So the 2017 Denver Moves Broadway Lincoln Corridor study, that study recommended that Lincoln retain its current lane configuration. So not only did it state that it needs to remain a one-way, but it also recommended that it generally remain as is from a vehicle capacity standpoint with those 3 travel lanes. That was a recommendation, 3 years ago, and that's what we're kind of using as our guiding document. That doesn't mean that we can't go back to the drawing board or look at this again as an opportunity, knowing that the world has changed in the last few years as it relates to safety and thinking about mode shift. However, we don't have anything in the hopper as it relates to a traffic study. So we need to do a pretty large traffic study to better understand kind of the capacity changes on the corridor by reducing a lane, not only on the weekends or in the evenings and overnight, but really in that peak period. And I did see that somebody mentioned kind of other corridors, other places around the country that are starting to do these types of major changes and reducing capacity. We don't disagree that that could be an opportunity here. We would just need to take our time and look at this in more detail as it relates to maybe something like reduction of a travel lane and how it affects the overall network.
And that was one of the requests, right, from the West Wash Park Neighborhood Association, is that definitely let's look at, let's look at it properly, not just doing it where it would be like some of the comments that I've seen online on the chat right now is that if you do reduce it, if the reduction that we're proposing right now of travel lanes off peak, would that impact the side streets? And based on our current data, it does not. But if a full reduction, we would need to conduct a more in-depth analysis, like you were saying, to assess that impact, correct?
That is correct. And, we're moving forward with a fairly large transit project in Colfax, East Colfax, with center running BRT as being kind of the preferred alternative moving forward. That is essentially a reduction of the travel lanes, right? One in each direction. And that the work that we did there over the last 8 years now demonstrates that from a modeling standpoint, we're going to see some diversion and we have to figure that out, and we're working through that. But as people have pointed out in the chat, not always does that come to fruition, but we just need to spend more time understanding what we think will happen if, something like a lane reduction were to be put in place.
Awesome. Thank you, Ryan. Brad. This is from Norman. Can we also install radar speed signs, speed awareness signs at strategic points along Lincoln to make sure people are aware that they're speeding?
Good question. Short answer is yes, we can consider doing that. We think that a lot of these other infrastructure improvements are going to probably, in our minds, they're a higher level of improvement to speeds and safety and things like that. But we can certainly evaluate along the corridor where we might add those speed feedback signs. There is criteria that needs to be met in order to do that, as you might know, but we can certainly do that. Yeah, good point.
Yeah, and we can work. So, Dottie has the criteria on our side for permanent ones, correct? But we can work with our DPD folks who they have themselves speed awareness signs, but that they move throughout their districts. And so we can certainly work with our DPD counterparts to once these are implemented to potentially at least put them in their rotation.
Good point.
These would not be the permanent ones. These DPDs have to move them around, but at least to get people be aware, like Norman was saying, of their speeds, and to at least be alert that there is a enforcement situation happening. Yeah. Actually, this next one is for you, Brad, as well. To clarify, this is from Ben. To clarify, the hardened center lines would be on either Virginia or Ellsworth for cars turning from those streets onto Lincoln or from Lincoln?
Both.
Okay.
So these hardened center lines, we get the most efficacy out of them when we put them. So Lincoln is, northbound running one way. When we actually put them on the eastbound approach to these intersections, that's where you have those higher left turn speeds coming off of Lincoln onto the side streets. This will encourage folks to make that left turn on a slower speed off of Lincoln. And then in some ways, we do think they have some residual benefits of the eastbound approaches when they're taking a left onto Lincoln. They're not able to cut over the striping anymore. They're hardened, and so it encourages them to make that full left turn, slowing them down, being able to see pedestrians and bikes and otherwise. So, good question.
Thanks. Zach, this next one is for you. How will the peak hour transit-only lanes be enforced?
Great question. Thank you. I think I forgot to mention that. And this is actually, I'll kind of drag this out a little bit. Sorry. We are in coordination with our right-of-way enforcement team on enforcing this section of Lincoln. And so actually it's worth noting that when we talked to them kind of more recently as we were kind of proposing this alternative to them, we expected them to say that this wouldn't be good for them, right? Because they'd have to come back and forth. They actually said that what we were proposing in those two very specific timeframes works so much better for them, because when you have those kind of two very specific timeframes, they are able to devote someone from their right-of-way enforcement office to be on the corridor, and they're also able to establish a relationship, or they already have a relationship with the tow truck company, and they can have someone stationed out there during those times. So essentially, right at 6 a.m., right at 3 p.m., a tow truck will be there and it'll be ready, and the enforcement folks will be there and stationed and ready to kind of move through and clear that lane, and then they'll kind of be there on standby, for the remainder of that bus only lane period, and can move cars, that have parked out pretty quickly. The alternative, they said, if we went with like the 24-hour lane and the 13-hour lane, then in that situation, they can't have someone stationed there all day. They can't have the tow truck company there all day, and essentially have to be, report it to right-of-way enforcement. They'd have to come out, call the tow truck company. Right-of-way enforcement said that they don't have priority for the tow trucks. Our police department does. So they've seen cases before where it's taken a couple of hours for the tow trucks to respond because they were busy just responding to other requests through DPD and things like that. So they actually favored the way that we're moving forward, and I think that'll be beneficial for the community as well, or for the the transit riders as well. Because it essentially assures that lane remains clear during those peak periods, and doesn't leave a lot of room for cars to sit for a long amount of time and block those buses. So there was a long-winded answer. Thank you for bringing that up. I think I skipped over that in my notes, so apologies and thank you.
Hey, Gabby, I got a little bit more. I mean, I think Zach did a really good job there, but maybe just another thought. So obviously, this is a fairly unique condition from a standpoint of having a transit lane and a parking lane. Most of our transit lanes in the city are either 24-hour facilities or pivot over to a drive lane in the off-peak. So enforcement's a little bit different. I think Zach explained kind of from a parking right-of-way enforcement standpoint how we expect to monitor and deal with that. DPD does do some enforcement in transit lanes. It's not their highest priority from a city standpoint, but they have indicated to us that they do try to enforce the transit lanes both on 15th and 17th and on Broadway Lincoln and other facilities around the city. I think we're going to have some additional conversations with them about these specifically and whether or not they can assist with that. But it's a really good comment, and I think Zach did a good job explaining overall.
Awesome. All right, Mr. Brett. Actually, Brett, Zach, I'm not sure who may be able to answer this one. Probably Brett. We've had a lot of comments on the Q&A about how this proposed design will impact if there's going to be any cut-through traffic. And so can you speak about sort of what the modeling or the data that we have developed for this, what has led to?
Yeah, sure. I can take a crack, and Ryan and Zach, feel free to chime in. But so we've heard a lot of comments about this cut-through traffic parallel to Lincoln, and they're very valid. One thing that we had previously done, we'd heard a lot about cut through on Sherman, just one block east. And a lot of that we were seeing was related to the Lincoln, Ohio intersection, and how the signal downstream was timed in a very weird way. So we did some signal timings there, tried to improve that. We're hoping that helped with a lot of the Sherman cut through previous to this project. Now with this project, like Zach mentioned, and he showed the graph with all the traffic volumes going up and down, really what we're doing with this project is like right sizing when we have travel lanes. So we have travel lanes when we need them, and as it is existing now with 3 lanes of general purpose lanes in the peak hour. And then when we don't need them in the off peak and in the nights and weekends, we don't have them. And when we don't have them, we're able to put parking and things like that to actually slow those vehicles down, kind of reclaim that space for almost speed mitigation in a way. So so we don't expect there to be any more significant impact to cut through traffic as it relates to this project. Zach and Ryan, you can feel free to chime in if you need.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. Right sizing the facility for the times of day that we're seeing the need the most. And I think we've accomplished that through a very, very somewhat complicated design process. But as we've mentioned before, we'll continue to monitor based on or after implementation.
Thank you. Actually, Ryan, if you don't mind staying on, we had a question. You mentioned sort of trade-offs. How does the city weigh cleaner air, safety, vision zero, noise reduction against the desire for personal car storage on land intended for public use? A good one.
Yeah, great question. Obviously, that in a nutshell is what keeps us planners and engineers up all night as we think about the future of our cities and the future of kind of how we move and mobility. Obviously, from a big picture standpoint, we have some pretty aggressive goals related to mode share. We have a 50% mode share goal for SOVs. And kind of within that, we have a 15% mode share for transit and a 15% mode share goal for bike ped.
That's
so
significant.
Very, very large, and that's within the next 10 years, so by 2030. So added pressure for us to figure that out over the next 10 years. So projects like this, obviously, we are constantly weighing kind of those trade-offs of how do we move people and how do we address some of those larger scale issues. And I think the answer is complicated, but boils down to when we start to make the improvements related to being more efficient with our space, including people riding transit, walking, riding bikes, car sharing, all those things that we talk about. And when we talk about alternative modes of transportation, they're going to pay dividends. They're going to pay dividends from a safety standpoint. They're going to pay dividends as it relates to climate change. They're going to pay dividends as it relates to all kinds of different things. And we have to be vigilant about continuing to be efficient with our space and continuing to work towards those mode shift goals. I think one of the key differences in this corridor is, and why it was a phase 2 as opposed to the phase 1 back in 2017, is that the residential context of the neighborhood. The residential context of the neighborhood was different than anything we had kind of encountered or that we were working on as it relates to an arterial with a lot of bus travel, with a lot of service audit as it relates to transit, and we had to be a little bit more intentional about how we approached this. So I think the parking question can go a lot of different ways, but what it boils down to is from the parking also provides a useful buffer from a ped safety standpoint. And as folks that live kind of in the southern section of this particular project know, that buffer is 2-3 feet with a 5-foot, semi-detached sidewalk. And we had kind of had to balance the transit needs with that known expectation from a ped safety standpoint and that feel from a safety standpoint as it relates to that particular section. So it was a lot of tough decisions had to be made. I think we found something that works mostly for everybody.
Right. And I guess in a way also, we can only, as DOTI staff, we can only push these projects so far. We also obviously need the support of the community to move these projects forwards as the trade-offs sort of get harder and harder, throughout the implementation of our multimodal goals. So thank you. Yeah. Zach and Brad, will curb and gutter and sidewalk removal and replacement be part of this project? Were wider sidewalks considered?
Those will not be part of this project. Wider sidewalks, no, were not considered as part of this project. I'm not sure if anyone else has any other information. I think the city's goal right now in terms of sidewalk is filling in a lot of the gaps that we have in our sidewalk network. As I'm sure some of you are aware, kind of, there's just like a lot of missing sidewalks across the city. So I think that is the goal for the sidewalk program, I'm getting the name wrong, I think it has a name, but for that sidewalk program, that's the goal is kind of filling in those gaps, and I think widening where possible when there's sidewalks that are under too small, like below standard, excuse me. So in some neighborhoods where you have like a 1.5 foot sidewalk or maybe a 2 foot sidewalk that doesn't meet any ADA standards currently, I think those are kind of like top priority as well.
But this does not have any sidewalk gaps, so the right. So and also this is, I mean, you have a very limited budget for this. This is only supposed to be sort of a quick, well, not quick, but relatively shorter time frame implementation of bus and transit improvements, not reconstructing the curb, correct?
That is correct. Yep.
I'll just add to that that is exactly right. And a project of that magnitude would require a whole nother like CIP budget ask if weren't part of the transit program, high capacity transit, like a Colfax type project. And that's just not what we're talking about here. We're talking about this, like you said, relatively quick implementation to get some better transit service and improve safety on the corridor.
For Zach, actually, was the 2017 Broadway Lincoln study based on the Vision Zero initiative? Or actually, Brett, I don't know if since you're
I can
also
answer that.
Oh, okay, Ryan. Go for it. Thank you.
Yeah, so 2017, that was kind of the time, that was right about the time Vision Zero was coined, and the idea around Vision Zero was really starting to gain a lot of steam nationally and of course ultimately in Denver. So I would say safety was a big part of that conversation as it relates to the corridor study. Was it as front and center as Vision Zero is currently today? I would say the answer is no. And that kind of highlights my earlier response that, it's always worth kind of thinking through and taking the opportunity to make sure that was the correct decision and whether or not we could do something else in the corridor and if it makes sense given the changes in our thinking and philosophy.
Awesome. All right. So we're going to continue trying to roll through all these questions, by the way. Technically, the meeting ends in about 15 minutes or so. So we're going to try to answer as many questions as possible here directly, verbally. Okay, so Zach and Ryan, why does the transit only lane begin at 6 a.m.? Could it start later? And actually, I would probably say this could also potentially be answered by Dan over in our RTD side. But take it away, guys.
Yeah, so the reason for that 6 a.m. start time is RTD. So currently the bus only lane operates from 7 a.m. to 9 a.m. And RTD is seeing, like, even though those tow trucks are out there, they obviously can't get everything cleared right at 7 a.m. So RTD is seeing that sometimes it takes about 30 minutes, and if there's a lot of cars, up to 45 minutes for that lane to clear, which is over, almost half of that bus only lane time. So that was part of the consideration. Also, RTD is starting to see delays, starting in that 6 a.m. hour between 6 and 7. As that volume starts to build. I think if you remember the volume slide, you see that that peak, that AM peak really kind of juts up right around 6 a.m. right after 6 a.m. And I think what RTD's data shows is that concurrent with that peak, they're seeing delays starting. So yeah, we definitely hear that concern, but that's why the 6 a.m. start time. Ryan, I don't know if you want to add anything, or Dan.
No, I think that's exactly correct. RTD is seeing delay earlier. Denver streets are getting busier. Denver's growing. That peak is expanding a little bit, especially earlier in the AM, and a need to get those buses unstuck and the travel time savings associated with that necessitated us to look at starting the bus only lane at 6 a.m.
Awesome. Brad, this is a little bit about design. Will there be any sort of visual indication for drivers when the lane changes from through traffic to parking on the west side?
Good question, Eric. The short answer is yes. You put the majority of this design for this transit lane will be relatively simple from a design perspective, but you put your finger on probably the most complex piece of this design, and that's how to indicate to folks on the southern end that parking lane, particularly on the west side, is going to change, or when a travel lane is going to change the parking. And so how we're doing that is a national best practice amount of signs and striping to do so. On the east side, we're not as worried about it because it kind of happens right now, and we have overhead signs to show what's going on, and we found that pretty decently effective. But you're right, on the west side, we'll be doing just as much signing and striping as we can. It will likely involve a solid edge line, lane line. If you want to get into specifics, it'll involve quite a few supplemental signs leading up to give motorists adequate warning before that happens.
Awesome. All right, I'm going to give the team a little bit of a break. There was one particular question about additional signals and RFBs on Lincoln. And so I guess the general question is, you know, with the new one that is being, so we have a new one coming in at Exposition as part of the I-25, the South Broadway and I-25. I think that Brad, I don't know if you have had any more follow-up, but the additional one that we may be, the next one that would be probably up to figure out whether there meets a warrant, and this is part of the Community Transportation Network South Central. Some of the projects is that question that if you guys participated in the survey was Virginia versus Dakota as for a comfort level for a bikeway. Virginia currently is the currently designated route. However, you know, a lot of people have told us that they don't feel comfortable in Virginia. Dakota would probably fit a better category of bikeway. However, Dakota does not have a traffic signal, you know, to stop traffic on Lincoln in order to let folks east and west go. So that's the only one that I have heard of the potentially upcoming warrant, depending on where the South Central community efforts are leading to. And then of course we have that one on the north side, but any other ones by any chance, Brad, or can you speak about the RFB or an RFB request for a corridor like Lincoln? Like what are the standards?
Oh, sure.
About?
Sure. Yeah, so I'll answer the first part of that. So like we said, Exposition, that's coming through as a traffic signal to be started construction, I believe later this year. Fifth Avenue, same thing, later this year. Dakota, so there's a couple efforts looking at Dakota, like Gabby mentioned, community networks, but then also we're doing a signal warrant there to see if that makes sense there. And then one other one that we've kind of sense might meet a warrant or need a signal is at 4th Avenue as well. So we're looking at a signal warrant study there as well, as I mentioned earlier. But to kind of the second point of RFBs along Lincoln, it's not really in safety's best interest for us, if we're putting a marked crosswalk across Lincoln, for us to put just an RFB. If we're putting a marked crosswalk across Lincoln, it's going to need to be what we call pedestrian hybrid beacon or hawk signal. It's the 3-section head that does the wig wag, if you remember that, or just a full-on traffic signal. And hence the reason why our conversation about adding pedestrian crossings has centered on traffic signals, is because due to the speeds and the volumes on Lincoln, you kind of need that level of infrastructure in order to really get people's attention, have them stop and yield to pedestrians to allow them to cross. So.
Wow. So basically, I was just looking at a map of the corridor, and basically, if after we conduct the warrants, basically we're conducting warrants at Dakota and 4th, right? That would basically just leave Maple. So the corridor will be pretty well signalized throughout, and just have enough breaks, locations where for folks to have complete traffic control for pedestrians to cross east to west or north to south. Yeah. All right, so this next one actually is for our friends over at RTD. Dan, with the new traffic light on Exposition, will the bus stop on Lincoln need to be moved to accommodate the bus turning wide from Exposition to Lincoln?
It's a great question. Thank you, Gabby. Our engineers have taken a look at this, and we are quite sure that our operators will be able to make that turn without relocating the bus stop. We will keep an eye on it as things progress once we start using that exit, and if need be, we will adjust as needed. But as of this time, we really think that it should be no problem at all.
Cool, nice. Mr. Ryan, could there be camera enforcement of bus lanes?
Yeah, so camera enforcement, specifically whether they're on buses or kind of on the side of the street from a camera standpoint. So there's some complications with that. For example, onboard enforcement, where there might be a camera located on the front of a bus to administer tickets, if you will, to vehicles that are misusing or cars parked that are misusing the transit lane, is actually a state level issue as it relates to bus only lanes and the legislative change that would be required to do that. It's something that we've started conversations about, and we're kind of still waiting. We haven't, while we've seen some compliance issues related to bus lanes, it hasn't been overwhelming to the point that we feel like that level of enforcement is necessary at this time. I think we want to graduate to something like that based on a need, and right now we're not seeing that need as it currently stands, and we'd like to use our current tools that are in place that we already have before going and making larger changes, especially at a legislative level.
All right. And so let's wrap up with one final question, because we have to allow a couple of minutes for the ending slides. Ryan, if there is overwhelming support or request for permanent two-lane, permanent bus lane, and permanent changes to the sidewalk to include permanent parking, how can the residents request this to be considered on future project and ask for budget?
So I'm getting a theme. I'm getting a sense of a theme here. So there's definitely a lot of folks that are really interested in the concept
wider
of
sidewalks.
Yeah, reduction of capacity and or kind of looking at that big picture aspect of, can we do something in the long term that is more geared towards the kind of the safety piece and a potential reduction in a travel lane. So I think the answer here is, obviously we've heard that through this conversation. We're going to take these comments, we're going to take what we're hearing today back to our leadership, to the city traffic engineer, and to others, and start to think about how we can look at this from a bigger programmatic standpoint, and where Broadway and Lincoln stand in terms of doing additional study and or looking at alternatives that weren't necessarily recommended in the previous study. So I think that's one piece of it. The other piece of it is through the RNO and through your city council person, Councilman Clark. That's another way. Yeah, that's another way of kind of getting this on the radar, that we need to look at doing a larger, in-depth, more intensive study of Lincoln as it relates to its capacity and thinking about its future.
Excellent. Thank you, team, for answering. I think it was close to 30 minutes or a little bit over of questions. I'm going to throw it back to Zach so he can tell us a little bit of sort of what comes next.
Great, thanks, Gabby, and I'm glad we were able to answer so many questions. I think when we did our run through over the past few days, it went a little bit longer, so I'm glad that we were on point today and we were able to answer a lot of the questions. If your question didn't get answered, I'm not, to be perfectly honest, I don't have the chat box open because I'm focusing on the presentation, but if there are a lot of questions, or there are any questions that didn't get answered, or if your question didn't get answered, just a reminder that we'll have that FAQ document within the next few days, which is a great segue. Oops, nope, not a great segue. Just to reiterate the project process, and then we'll get into my segue. Again, we started with kind of that visioning. We did some analysis, did the design, did some analysis, based on your feedback, and now we're at kind of step 5, where we're refining through input. We're communicating the refined options to the community. Again, if there's anything that's in the chat box that is worth kind of looking at to make some tweaks, we can do that. But it sounds like I don't know, I just saw kind of like larger kind of next step questions. So it sounds like, from here we'll refine the option and ready our design teams and our operations teams to get ready for a fall implementation. There we go. So thank you all for joining us. I see quite a few folks have made it through to 7 o'clock with us. I appreciate all of you staying here and listening and asking questions. This has been great. If you have any further questions, feel free to email the transit@denvergov.org email. Also, here's a shortened link to our project website, bit.ly/Lincoln Transit, or bit.ly. Make sure to capitalize the L and the T, it is case sensitive. And then just a reminder that a recording of this meeting and questions and answers can be found at that website after June 30th. I'll work with Gabby as well to get a recording on the Dottie YouTube page. But all of this information will be available on our webpage as well. It's also worth noting that we'll put together some graphics for folks that help explain things a little bit more or just provide a little bit more detail. Obviously, our traditional way of doing these meetings would have been to, have, probably like an open house with boards that can, really allow you to dive in on a topic if you want, and, can really like kind of lay things out a little bit better than walking through a PowerPoint. It's just a little bit different presentation. So we'll add some additional graphics on this website as well for folks to take a look at. I'll leave this up for a couple minutes here, so folks can write down those links and those addresses, or take a picture, whatever you need to do. And thank you all for joining us, and thanks to the team for joining me today and helping me answer questions and talk through the safety and all this good stuff. So thank you, and have a great night.
Thank you, everybody. Good night.